Courageous team saves black twin goats from ferocious wolf pack wolf goat. We can't risk human lives for a couple of farm animals, Margaret. My decision is final. We shoot the wolves at dawn. Those farm animals are the last of the rare Blackwell twins, Sheriff, and I haven't spent 40 years saving animals to watch you destroy an entire wolf pack when I know there's a better way. The emergency town meeting had erupted into chaos. Margaret Wilson stood her ground, her 73-year-old frame rigid with determination as she faced Sheriff Robert Davis across the worn wooden table in the community center. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concerned faces of the 24 townsfolk who had gathered on this stormy night. Outside, thunder cracked as the situation inside grew equally electric. 3 farms hit in a week. Sheriff Davis slammed his fist on the table. 2 dogs killed, livestock scattered, and now Tom's prize goats cornered in the North Ravine with a pack of wolves closing in. We don't have time for your conservation fantasies. Margaret's weathered hands gripped a faded leather journal. Those wolves didn't just appear, Robert. They were driven here when the logging operation cut through their territory, and those twin goats are worth more than you know. Frank Thompson, Margaret's neighbor and oldest friend, rose shakily to his feet, his Vietnam veteran's cap set firmly on his silver hair. I've known Margaret Wilson for 40 years. If she says there's another way, there is. Sarah Johnson, Margaret's granddaughter, stepped forward, her wildlife conservation credentials hanging around her neck. The storm's getting worse. If we don't act now, we'll lose the goats and probably end up shooting the wrong wolves in this weather. The sheriff's radio crackled. Davis here, he barked. Sir, the situation's critical, came the static-filled reply. Tom Baker says the wolves are closing in, maybe 30 minutes before they reach the ravine where the goats are trapped. All eyes turned to Margaret. One chance, Sheriff Davis growled, towering over her. You have one chance, and if anyone gets hurt, it's on you. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Margaret was enjoying a quiet evening at her farmhouse on the outskirts of Pine Creek, a small town nestled in the foothills where she had spent her entire life. The rain had just begun to patter against the windows of Margaret's century-old farmhouse. Her arthritic hands gently stroked the elderly border collie curled beside her chair as she flipped through a photo album filled with images from her 40-year career as the town's veterinarian. Faces of countless animals she'd saved stared back at her, from prize bulls to household pets, each one a victory. "Remember this one, Rusty?" she murmured to the dog. "The miller's calf born breech in that terrible blizzard of '79. The border collie thumped his tail in response, as if he too remembered that frigid February night. The telephone's ring cut through the peaceful moment. Margaret reached for the receiver, her movements deliberate but quick for a woman her age. "Margaret Wilson speaking," she answered, immediately recognizing the panicked voice of Tom Baker, who ran the largest farm on the north side of town. "Dr. Wilson, I know you're retired, but we've got a situation. Those wolves everyone's been talking about, they've cornered my black twins in the North Ravine." Margaret sat up straighter. "The Blackwell twins, are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am. My boy spotted them this morning, and now the whole wolf pack is circling. I've called Sheriff Davis, but I thought you should know. Those goats are the last of their kind around here." "I'll be right there." Margaret hung up and moved with purpose, pulling her veterinary bag from the closet where it had sat mostly unused since her retirement 5 years ago. The Blackwell twin goats were special, a rare heritage breed that had been part of the county's history since pioneer days, known for their unusual black coats and remarkable intelligence. Tom's pair might be the last purebred specimens in the state. She dialed another number as she gathered supplies. "Frank, it's Margaret. Remember that talk we had about the wolves last month? Well, they've found the Blackwell twins at Tom's place. I'm heading over to the community center. Can you meet me there?" Without waiting for her old friend to finish his concerned questions, she added, "And call Sarah, please. We'll need her expertise tonight." As Margaret drove through the increasing rain, her mind was clear despite the urgency. At 73, she'd seen enough crises to know panic was the enemy of good judgment. Her thoughts drifted to the timber company that had begun clear-cutting operations in the hills last spring, despite the Conservation Committee's warnings about wildlife disruption. The wolves hadn't been a problem in 30 years, not since she was a young vet working with the State Wildlife Agency to help relocate the last troublesome pack in 1976. The community center parking lot was already filling with pickup trucks when Margaret arrived. She recognized Tom Baker's mud-splattered Ford and Sheriff Davis's official vehicle among them. Inside, concerned voices echoed off the paneled walls. Frank Thompson was already there, His tall, lean frame stooped slightly with age, but his eyes alert and concerned beneath his silver hair. At 75, the former ranch hand and Vietnam veteran had been Margaret's neighbor and friend for decades, their farms adjoining on the east side of Pine Creek. "Margaret," he greeted her with a nod. "Sarah's on her way, should be here in 20 minutes. Sheriff Robert Davis dominated the center of the room, his uniform stretched across his substantial frame. At 64, he'd been sheriff for nearly 20 years, and Margaret had known him since he was a boy who brought injured rabbits to her clinic. "The situation is straightforward," the sheriff was explaining to the gathered crowd. "We've got a wolf pack that's killed 2 dogs and scattered livestock on 3 properties. Now they've got Tom's prize goats cornered. We'll organize a hunting party at dawn." "Hunting party?" Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs of agreement. All heads turned as she made her way forward, veterinary bag in hand. "Robert, you know better than that," Sheriff Davis sighed visibly. "Margaret, these aren't the old days. We don't have time for wildlife relocations and rehabilitation. These wolves are an immediate threat to livelihoods." Tom Baker nodded vigorously. "Those goats are worth $5,000 apiece, Margaret, and they're not just money, they're living history in this county." "All the more reason to handle this correctly," Margaret replied, setting her bag on the table. "Killing the wolves won't solve the root problem. They were driven here when their territory was disrupted." Dr. James Miller, the younger veterinarian who had taken over Margaret's practice, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Dr. Wilson, wolf behavior has changed since your day. These modern packs are more aggressive, less afraid of human settlements." Margaret fixed her successor with a steady gaze. "Wildlife doesn't become modern, James. Wolves are wolves. Their behavior is consistent when you understand their motivations." The debate was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Johnson, Margaret's granddaughter, shaking rain from her jacket as she entered. At 36, Sarah had followed her grandmother's love of animals into a career as a wildlife conservationist with the State Environmental Agency. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, pulling out a tablet computer. "I've been tracking this pack for months. They're not naturally aggressive, they've been displaced." She placed the tablet on the table, showing a map with tracking data. "Their traditional hunting grounds were here until the logging operation pushed them west. Now they're hunting unfamiliar territory during a season when their normal prey is scarce." The meeting quickly divided into factions, those supporting the sheriff's direct approach versus those willing to hear Margaret and Sarah's alternative. As the debate heated up, Frank Thompson stood quietly by Margaret's side, his presence a solid reminder of decades of practical experience on the land. "Time is critical," Margaret finally said, raising her voice above the arguing. "Those goats won't survive the night if the wolves are hungry enough, but there's something you should all know about this particular pack." She pulled the faded leather journal from her bag and opened it to a page marked with an old photograph. "This pack has distinctive markings. The alpha female has a unique silver pattern on her face. I treated her as a pup back in '95 when we had that wildfire that drove the wildlife into town." Murmurs spread through the room as Margaret continued. "I can identify this pack, and I know how to divert them without bloodshed, but we need to act now before the storm gets worse." Sheriff Davis looked skeptical. "You're talking about a wolf that would be, what, nearly 30 years old? That's impossible." "Not the same wolf, Robert," Margaret explained patiently, "but her descendants. Wolf packs keep to family lines, and they pass down behaviors through generations. This marking is genetic. I've seen it in their pack for decades." It was at this moment that Tom Baker's son burst into the community center, dripping wet and out of breath. "The wolves are moving closer. Dad, they'll reach the ravine in less than an hour." And that's when the emergency meeting had erupted into chaos, culminating in the confrontation between Margaret and Sheriff Davis that we witnessed at the beginning. Frank announced, immediately focusing on the task at hand. Tom's revelation would have to wait. Back at the ravine edge, Margaret and Sarah watched with tense anticipation as the Blackwell twins made their way steadily upward, responding to Margaret's periodic whistle calls. The goats were remarkably sure-footed despite the slippery conditions, finding invisible holds in the ravine wall. "They're almost here," Sarah whispered. "But look, the wolves have noticed." At the far end of the ravine, the wolf pack had become alert, several members pacing anxiously as they realized their prey was escaping. Margaret quickly applied more scent deterrent, creating a stronger barrier. "Sarah, start making your way back to the corral. I'll guide the goats." "I'm not leaving you alone, Grandma," Sarah protested. "I'm not asking," Margaret replied with a firm tone Sarah recognized from childhood. "If those wolves charge, someone needs to be at the corral to secure it immediately." Reluctantly, Sarah began making her way back through the rain while Margaret continued calling to the goats. The Blackwell twins had almost reached the top of the ravine when the situation suddenly escalated. The alpha wolf, a large female with the distinctive silver facial marking Margaret had mentioned, let out a howl that echoed through the ravine. In response, the pack began moving quickly toward the east entrance. "They're coming!" Sheriff Davis shouted from his observation position. "Margaret, get out of there!" But Margaret held her ground, applying the last of the scent deterrent in a thick line between herself and the approaching wolves. The Blackwell twins had reached the top of the ravine and were now hesitating, startled by the commotion. "Go on," Margaret urged them, making a sweeping motion with her arm while continuing the whistle pattern. The goats seemed to understand, trotting in the direction of the corral where Sarah was now waiting with Frank and Tom. The wolf pack had reached the base of the ravine's east side and started to climb. The scent barrier was causing them to hesitate, but the alpha female was pushing forward, driven by hunger and the instinct to secure food for her pack. At this critical moment, Sheriff Davis raised his rifle. "No!" Margaret shouted. "Give the deterrent time to work." The alpha wolf had stopped, clearly detecting the threatening scent. She growled, taking a step back, then another. The rest of the pack followed her lead, retreating slightly. Margaret began backing away slowly, never taking her eyes off the wolves. The Blackwell twins were now nearly at the corral, guided by Sarah's continuation of the whistle calls Margaret had taught her years ago. Just when it seemed the plan was working perfectly, a sudden crack of thunder spooked both humans and animals. The Blackwell twins bolted, but not toward the corral. They veered off into the darkness of the surrounding woods. "The goats!" Tom yelled. "They're running." The wolves, sensing the chaos, began to advance again, no longer deterred by the scent barrier that the intensifying rain was now diluting. "Plan B," Margaret called out, her voice carrying remarkable strength. "Frank, the recording!" Frank Thompson hurried to his truck and returned with an old cassette player technology from another era that brought puzzled looks from the younger members of the group. "Trust me," Margaret said, taking the device and pressing play. Immediately, the recorded sounds of multiple large predators, bears growling and mountain lions screaming, blasted from the speaker. The effect on the wolves was immediate. Confronted with what sounded like a gathering of apex predators, the pack retreated, the alpha female leading them back down into the ravine and toward the west exit. "It worked," Sarah exclaimed. "But the goats, they'll be heading for high ground," Margaret said confidently. "It's their instinct during storms." "There's only one elevated clearing within a quarter-mile, the old Thompson pasture." Frank nodded in agreement. "My father's grazing field. It's been empty for years, but it's still fenced on 3 sides. Tom, Dr. Miller, secure the area here in case the wolves return," Margaret directed. "Sheriff, if you and your deputies could patrol the perimeter of the ravine. Frank, Sarah, and I will go after the goats." Despite the storm and darkness, Margaret moved with purpose as she led Sarah and Frank toward the old Thompson pasture. Her decades of knowledge of the local terrain proved invaluable as she navigated hidden paths and shortcuts. "Grandma," Sarah asked as they walked, "how did you know that recording would work? That technology must be from the 80s. Margaret smiled. 1983, to be exact. Part of a wildlife management study I participated in before modern tracking systems existed. Sometimes old solutions still work for new problems." Frank chuckled. "Your grandmother was using predator vocalizations to manage livestock protection before the government had an official policy on it. She just called it common sense back then." As they approached the old pasture, they could hear the distinctive bleating of the Blackwell twins. The goats had indeed sought the highest ground, just as Margaret had predicted. "There they are," Sarah pointed to 2 dark shapes huddled under the partial shelter of an ancient oak tree at the pasture's center. Margaret approached slowly, whistle in hand, and gave the familiar call. The goats' response was immediate. They trotted toward her with what almost seemed like relief. "They remember you," Frank remarked. "They remember the call, not me," Margaret corrected, though there was no mistaking the affection in her voice as she ran her hands over the goats, checking for injuries. "They're fine, just scared and wet." Sarah was examining the goats with a more clinical eye. "These really are remarkable specimens. The Blackwell line is thought to be almost extinct in this region, which makes it even more irresponsible to leave them vulnerable," Margaret said, with a pointed look toward the direction of Tom Baker's farm. Frank helped secure makeshift leads on the goats. "Speaking of Tom, he was about to tell me something important about these goats when we got your signal." Seemed troubled about it. Margaret's expression grew serious. I've had my suspicions. Tom's been facing financial problems since the timber company deal fell through. These goats would fetch a very high price from collectors. You think he left them vulnerable on purpose? Sarah asked, shocked. For what an insurance claim if they were killed? Or to create a crisis that would justify eliminating the wolf pack, Margaret suggested grimly. The timber company would certainly appreciate having the wolf problem solved before their environmental impact assessment next month. As they began leading the goats back toward the vehicles, the storm finally started to abate. The rain lightened to a drizzle, and occasional breaks in the clouds revealed a quarter moon providing welcome illumination. We should get these animals to safety, then deal with Tom's potential involvement later, Frank suggested pragmatically. Margaret nodded in agreement. The old barn on my property would be best. It's secure and I have supplies there. They had just reached the edge of the pasture when Sarah's phone chimed with a message. It's Dr. Miller, she reported after checking the screen. The wolves have moved off to the northwest, away from the farms. Sheriff Davis is following at a distance to make sure they keep going. Good, Margaret nodded. That gives us time to secure these goats and then have a serious conversation with Tom Baker. By the time they returned to the assembled vehicles with the Blackwell twins safely in tow, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. Sheriff Davis had returned and was engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with Tom Baker. Dr. Miller stood nearby, looking troubled. What's happening? Margaret asked as they approached. Sheriff Davis turned, his expression a mix of disappointment and professional detachment. Tom here was just explaining some interesting facts about these prize goats. Facts he neglected to mention earlier. Tom Baker couldn't meet Margaret's eyes. I was going to tell you, Margaret, I swear I was. Tell me what exactly? Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already had suspicions. Dr. Miller stepped forward. I noticed something odd about the goats' ear tags when we were setting up the corral. The registration numbers didn't match what should be on file for the Blackwell twins. I called a colleague at the Agricultural Extension Office. Sheriff Davis continued. These aren't just valuable heritage goats, Margaret. They're part of a state-funded breeding program. Tom was paid to maintain them safely as part of a conservation effort. Money he apparently took while neglecting proper security measures. Tom Baker's shoulders slumped. The timber company offered me a deal. They wanted the environmental studies to show the wolf pack was dangerous, needed to be removed. All I had to do was report some livestock losses and create a situation. You deliberately left those goats vulnerable, Margaret said, her voice quiet but filled with disappointment. Endangered animals under your protection. I needed the money, Tom protested. The bank's about to foreclose on land that's been in my family for generations. The timber company promised to buy my north acreage at double market value if the wolf problem was resolved before their permits came up for review. Sheriff Davis shook his head. That's multiple counts of fraud, Tom, not to mention animal endangerment and conspiracy to violate wildlife protection statutes. Frank Thompson, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. The wolves were never the problem, were they? Just convenient scapegoats for human greed, same as it's been since I was a boy. As the deputies took Tom Baker aside to continue the formal questioning, Margaret turned her attention back to the Blackwell twins, now calmly standing beside Sarah. The rare goats seemed remarkably composed after their ordeal, their intelligent eyes taking in the scene. What happens to them now? Sarah asked, gently stroking one goat's rain-dampened coat. They'll go to the state conservation program where they belong, Margaret replied. But I might see if they can stay at my place until permanent arrangements are made. My barn's been too quiet since I retired. Dr. Miller approached, looking somewhat abashed. Margaret, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your methods as outdated, but they worked perfectly. There's clearly value in those old-fashioned techniques. Margaret smiled. No apology needed, James. Good veterinary practice has always been about combining the best of what we know with the best of what we're learning. That's why I wanted you to take over my practice. You understand the science, and in time, you'll develop the instincts too. The group began packing up to leave as the storm clouds finally parted completely, revealing a sky filled with stars. The crisis had been resolved, the wolves were safely moving back toward their natural territory, and the Blackwell twins were secure. Now, back to where we started at the emergency town meeting, when Margaret stood her ground against Sheriff Davis's plan to shoot the wolves. The confrontation that seemed so tense at the beginning now had its resolution. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat on her porch with Frank and Sarah, watching the Blackwell twins graze contentedly in the fenced pasture adjacent to her barn. The state conservation officials had agreed to let the rare goats remain at Margaret's farm temporarily, with Sarah overseeing their care as part of her official duties. The timber company's permit applications were denied, Sarah reported, setting down her coffee cup. The environmental impact review cited the stable wolf population as an essential part of the ecosystem. They'll have to find another location, preferably one without endangered species. Frank nodded with satisfaction. And Tom? Community service and a hefty fine, Margaret replied. Robert Sheriff Davis pushed for leniency, given Tom's financial situation and his eventual cooperation. He'll be working at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for the next year. Seems fitting, Frank remarked. Maybe he'll learn something about conservation along the way. The three sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the golden late afternoon light playing across the fields. Margaret's border collie, Rusty, dozed at her feet, occasionally opening one eye to check on the goats. You know, Sarah said thoughtfully, what happened that night is already changing things around here. Dr. Miller called me yesterday to ask about incorporating wildlife management techniques into his veterinary practice. And the county commissioners are discussing a new land use policy that would create protected corridors for wildlife movement. Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people of what matters. Those wolves and goats did more for conservation awareness than a dozen town meetings could have. Frank reached over to pat Margaret's hand affectionately. You did more, Mags, standing your ground, insisting there was a better way than violence. Reminds me of when we were young during the Vietnam protests. You never did take the easy path. Speaking of paths, Sarah interjected, the State Wildlife Agency called. They'd like you to consult on their predator management program, Grandma. Said something about needing to bridge traditional knowledge with modern methods. Margaret looked surprised, then pleased. Well, I suppose retirement was getting a bit dull anyway. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Margaret's farm, she reflected on how a single night had changed so much. The wolf pack was now being properly tracked and protected. The Blackwell twins were safe and contributing to the preservation of their rare breed. And perhaps most importantly, the community had been reminded that wisdom doesn't expire with age. Sheriff Davis's patrol car appeared at the end of Margaret's long driveway, crawling slowly up the gravel path. When he parked and stepped out, he was carrying a large envelope. Evening, Robert, Margaret called from the porch. Coffee's still hot if you'd like some. The sheriff climbed the porch steps, removing his hat. Wouldn't say no to that, Margaret. He nodded greetings to Frank and Sarah before settling into the vacant rocking chair. After Margaret brought him a steaming cup, he handed her the envelope. Official letter of commendation from the State Environmental Agency. Governor's signature and everything. Thought you might like to have it properly delivered. Margaret accepted the envelope with a smile. Thank you, though I don't need certificates to tell me I did the right thing. Maybe not, the sheriff agreed, but recognition matters. Your methods saved those goats, preserved the wolf pack, and exposed corruption. Not bad for one rainy night's work. He took a sip of coffee before adding, I've been thinking about what you said about old solutions for new problems. Got me looking at some of the county's historical records on wildlife management. Find anything interesting? Frank asked. Sheriff Davis nodded. As a matter of fact, I did. Back in the 1950s, before massive development, this county had a system of natural corridors that wildlife used to move between habitats without encountering farms or homes. Over time, we built over most of them, forcing animals into conflict with people. Exactly what I've been saying in my reports, Sarah confirmed. Wildlife doesn't suddenly decide to become problematic. We disrupt their patterns and then blame them for adapting. The conversation continued as twilight deepened into evening. Four people from different generations and backgrounds, united by a shared experience and a common respect for the balance between human needs and the natural world. Inside the barn, the Blackwell twins settled into fresh straw, their rare genetics now part of a protected program that would ensure their kind wouldn't disappear from the landscape. And somewhere in the distant hills, a wolf pack with a distinctive silver-marked alpha female hunted safely in territory now officially recognized as essential habitat. Margaret Wilson, at 73, had discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of purpose or contribution. Her lifetime of experience had proven its value in a crisis, reminding everyone, including herself, that wisdom accumulated over decades couldn't be found in any textbook or replaced by technology. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret excused herself briefly and returned with a bottle of whiskey and 4 glasses. This seems like an occasion worth marking, she said, pouring modest measures for each of them. To old knowledge and new beginnings. They raised their glasses in the warm glow of the porch light. Four people who had faced danger together and emerged with a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between past and future, between human needs and natural wisdom. And to the unexpected paths that lead us home, Frank added softly, his eyes meeting Margaret's in a look that spoke of shared history and perhaps, in their sunset years, new possibilities. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.